Empire of Blood. Episode 9. The Butcher of Fezzan, Rodolfo Graziani and the Pacification of Libya. The goats are gone first. That is how Aisha remembers it beginning. Not with soldiers, not with fire, not with the sounds she will spend the rest of her life trying to forget. First, the goats are simply gone. Her family's small herd, the source of milk and meat and the slow accumulation of the modest wealth that keeps a family viable in the high plateau country of Cyrenaica, driven off in the night by men she could not see. She wakes to silence where there should have been sound, and the silence tells her something is wrong before her eyes have confirmed it. It is the spring of 1930. Aisha is 17 years old. She lives in a village of perhaps 80 people on the Jebel Akhdar, the Green Mountain, and the ridge of fertile limestone that runs along the northeastern corner of what Italy has named Libya. This land has been part of the Ottoman Empire, then briefly independent, and is now, on maps in Rome, in the official correspondence of Italian colonial administration, in the speeches of Italian politicians who have never set foot here. Italian territory. Her family is Bedouin or semi-settled Bedouin, a people whose relationship to the land is ancient and complex, and not particularly interested in what the latest empire claims about ownership. They have lived here, on this plateau above the sea, for generations. The caves in the limestone ridges hold the bones of their dead. The wells are positioned where generations of her ancestors learned that water could be found. The goats disappear on a Tuesday. By Thursday, the soldiers arrive. So they come in the early morning, when the light is still low and the village is just beginning to stir. She hears them before she sees them. The mechanical grinding of trucks on the track that serves as the approach road. The sound alien and wrong in the particular way that machines are wrong in a place that has never heard them. Then voices, Italian voices giving orders that most of the villagers cannot understand. The language arriving before its meaning, a wall of incomprehensible sound that by its volume and its tone conveys the essential message without requiring translation. You will do what we say. Some of the elders try to negotiate. This is what you do, in a culture built around the management of competing interests through speech, through the slow, patient process of reaching agreement between men of standing. Her grandfather steps forward, a man who has resolved water disputes and bride prices and grazing conflicts across 4 decades of community life, a man whose authority rests on his credibility and his judgment and his capacity to find the arrangement that everyone can live with. He begins to speak in Arabic, formal Arabic, the Arabic of men addressing other men with the assumption of mutual respect. The Italian officer does not slow down. He does not even look at the grandfather directly. He says something to his sergeant, and the sergeant moves past the old man with the smooth indifference of someone moving past a piece of furniture. The soldiers spread through the village. They are not violent, not yet, but they move through the spaces of the community with a proprietorial ease that is its own kind of violence. The violence of people who have already decided that the space and everything in it belongs to them. Pack what you can carry, the interpreter says. You are being relocated. Relocated. Aisha will think about that word for years. The clean, bureaucratic neutrality of it. Relocated, as if the village is a file being moved from one drawer to another. Relocated, as if the 80 people who have organized their entire lives around this specific piece of plateau, these wells, these caves, these grazing routes, these graves, can simply pick up and be deposited somewhere else without anything essential being destroyed. She looks at her mother, who is looking at the village elder, Meist, who is looking at the interpreter with an expression that she will later describe as the look of a man who has understood something terrible and has not yet decided whether to believe it. Her younger brother, 9 years old, is still sleeping in the tent when the soldiers come. She goes to wake him, and she carries him out on her hip, the way you carry a child. And for a moment, just a moment, everything is ordinary. A girl carrying her little brother. The morning light on the limestone, the smell of the plateau in spring, the sound of birds. Then a soldier takes her brother's hand to move them along the column that is forming, and the normalcy breaks like a stone. She does not know the name Rodolfo Graziani yet. She will learn it. But already, in this moment, what his name means is arriving in her life through the soles of her feet, through the weight of her brother on her hip, through the smell behind her that is the smell of everything she has ever known being unmade. She is 17 years old, and she has just been inducted, without consent, without understanding, into the category of person that empires create when they need to do something to a population and cannot call it what it is. The Italians have several names for what is happening. Pacification is the official one. Behind it, in the internal military correspondence that she will never read, are other words. Operazioni di sgombero, clearance operations. Concentramento, concentration. The language is clinical, as the language of mass displacement always is, because clinical language is language that has been specifically designed to prevent the thing being described from being felt. So you cannot feel concentramento. You can feel the smell of your village burning behind you as you walk away from it. You can feel that for a very long time. In the column around her, families walk in the silence of people who have not yet decided how to hold what is happening. An old woman, her neighbor from the adjacent tent, moves with the slow determination of someone who has survived hard things before and intends to survive this one. A young man, a few years older than Aisha, catches her eye and looks away quickly with the expression of someone who wants to do something and cannot find the thing to do. Two children chase each other around the legs of the column until a soldier shouts and they stop and press against their mother's side. The normalcy of the children playing is the most unbearable detail. The way the world continues to contain ordinary moments inside the extraordinary one. But already, in this moment, the consequences of who he is and what he has decided are arriving in her life with the grinding of trucks on a dirt track. He is not here. He is hundreds of miles away, in a comfortable office in Benghazi, reviewing maps and reports and writing memos in the flat, administrative language that turns villages into coordinates and families into population units. He will not see this village. He will not see her grandfather's face. He will not see her brother being walked into a column. He will read a report that says the relocation of the Jebel population has been completed on schedule. He will mark it as satisfactory. Behind the column that is forming on the track, a soldier lights a torch and moves into the first tent. And so there is always an official reason. The structures might shelter rebels, the supplies might sustain resistance. The village, if left standing, would be a resource that undermined the pacification. There is always a reason. The torch moves from tent to tent, and by the time the column has walked far enough that Aisha can no longer see the village, she can smell it burning. She can smell it burning for a long time. This is the story of the man who ordered the burning. Not just of one village, but of a way of life, a culture, a population that Italy had decided was an obstacle to the colony it wanted to build on top of them. Not just of the burning, but of the barbed wire, and the concentration camps, and the executions, and the starvation, and the disease that killed, by conservative estimate, 50,000 people in 4 years. Not just of the atrocity itself, but of how it was organized, justified, managed, and then largely forgotten by the country that did it. His name was Rodolfo Graziani. His title, eventually, was Governor General of Libya. His method was what he called pacification, which is one of the oldest euphemisms in the imperial vocabulary, a word that uses the language of peace to describe the imposition of violence. Let's find out who he was and how he got there and what he built. But before the history begins, one more thing about that morning. In the years after the camps, when Aisha tells this story, and she will tell it to her children and grandchildren, and eventually to a Libyan researcher who records it in the 1980s, she returns to the same detail every time. The grandfather, the way he stepped forward to speak, carrying the full weight of his authority and his lifetime of resolving disputes through patient speech. The way the Italian officer moved past him without a glance. The way the old man stood for a moment after, still in the posture of someone making an address, with no one left to address. She says, "I think that was the moment my grandfather understood something I did not yet understand, that we were not going to be negotiated with, that the category of person the soldiers were treating us as was a category in which negotiation was not available. He understood this, and he lowered his arms, and he went to get his things, and I have never forgotten his face when he lowered his arms." That face is what this episode is about. The moment of understanding. The moment a community discovers that the rules it has organized its life around no longer apply, and that the new rules are being written by someone who has not consulted them and does not intend to. The man writing the new rules was in Benghazi. Let's find out who he was, and how he got there, and what he built. Italy arrived in Libya in 1911 with a very specific kind of confidence. The confidence of a country that knew it was doing something shameless, but had decided that shame was a luxury it could not afford. The story of Italian colonialism in Libya begins as so many colonial stories do, not with the place being colonized, but with the domestic politics of the colonizing country. In 1911, Italy was a young nation, unified only 50 years earlier, still grappling with the profound gaps between its industrial north and its agrarian south, between its European ambitions and its actual capacities, between the great power status it claimed and the great power respect it had not yet fully earned. It had a parliament, a king, a growing industrial economy in the Piedmont and Lombardy regions, and a chronic need to demonstrate that it was a serious state in a world where seriousness was measured in colonial territory. The major colonial territories had already been claimed. Britain had India, Burma, vast swaths of Africa, Australia, Canada. France had Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, Indochina. Germany had its African colonies. Even Belgium had the Congo, a claim so grotesque in its implementation that it had actually managed to shock a world generally inured to colonial violence. The scramble for Africa had been essentially completed at the Berlin Conference of 1884, where European powers had divided the continent with the pragmatic arbitrariness of men drawing lines on a map of a place none of them had visited. Italy had been at the Berlin Conference. It had gotten very little. It had Eritrea on the Red Sea coast. It had Somalia. It had attempted to take Ethiopia and had been catastrophically defeated at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, a defeat that remained a profound national wound for a generation of Italian military men and politicians, the wound that needed redeeming, the humiliation that defined what Italy was not yet but needed to become. Libya, which was in 1911 still a collection of Ottoman provinces called Tripolitania and Cyrenaica, was what remained. It was, from Rome's perspective, available. The Ottoman Empire was weakening, its hold on distant provinces increasingly nominal. The French had Algeria directly to the west, Britain had Egypt directly to the east. Italy, looking at the map, decided that what sat between them was its natural inheritance, Never mind that roughly 1 million people lived there, organized into tribal confederations and sedentary communities and nomadic networks that had been managing this particular stretch of North Africa for millennia. Never mind that those people had not been consulted, had not requested Italian governance, and would very quickly demonstrate that they preferred not to have it. The logic of European imperialism in 1911 did not require the consent of the people being imperialized. It required only the force to take what you had decided was yours. The people of Libya in 1911 are not a population without history or political organization. The tribes of Tripolitania in the West have their own systems of governance, their own juridical traditions rooted in Islamic law, their own economic relationships built around the trans-Saharan trade routes that have moved goods and people across the desert for 1,000 years. The Bedouin and semi-nomadic communities of Cyrenaica in the east have developed, over generations, a sophisticated system of land tenure, water rights, and seasonal grazing movement that is invisible to Italian colonial administrators, because it is not written down in the kind of documents that European administrative systems recognize as law, invisible and therefore available. This is one of the fundamental mechanisms of colonial land appropriation, the systematic misreading of non-European land tenure as the absence of land tenure. Because the Bedouin do not have title deeds, their land is terra nullius, empty land, belonging to no one, available for appropriation. Because the grazing routes are not mapped in Italian surveying systems, they do not exist. Because the wells are not registered in Italian land registries, they are unowned. The colonial legal apparatus reaches into the landscape of Cyrenaica and reads it as empty, and then proceeds on the basis of that reading. And the people whose lives are organized around the landscape it has declared empty are left to demonstrate, against the full weight of an imperial military apparatus, that they were there all along. They attempt this demonstration. The resistance to Italian occupation in Libya from 1911 to 1931 is one of the most sustained anti-colonial struggles in 20th century African history. And it receives a fraction of the attention it deserves, partly because it ended in defeat, and partly because the victors controlled the archives. Italy declared war on the Ottoman Empire in September 1911. The declaration is made without the consultation of Parliament and relies on a pretext so flimsy that even Italian newspapers comment on its inadequacy. The official justification is that the Ottoman government has obstructed Italian commercial activities in Libya, and that Italy is therefore justified in taking military action to protect its interests. The commercial interests in question are largely theoretical. Italy has not, at the point of the declaration, developed substantial trade in Libya, and the obstruction is invented. The real justification is imperial appetite, dressed in the language of commerce, because naked imperial appetite is not the kind of thing you put in a formal declaration. This is not unusual. The language of European imperial justification in this period has a standard vocabulary: protecting commercial interests, restoring order, answering the call of civilization, responding to the invitation of the local population. The vocabulary is designed to provide cover for the thing being done, and it works in the limited sense that it satisfies the European powers that have a formal interest in maintaining the fiction that imperial expansion is something other than imperial expansion. The Libyan population that has not invited Italy has not requested order. It has no commercial relationship to protect, and will shortly make its views on the matter absolutely clear with armed resistance, is not part of the intended audience for the declaration. The Italian press covered it with a nationalist enthusiasm that today reads as both embarrassing and instructive. Libya was described as a land of promise, as Italy's fourth shore, as the natural extension of the Roman Empire across the Mediterranean. There was genuine popular excitement. Poets wrote verses, politicians made speeches. The vocabulary was of destiny, of civilization, of Italy finally claiming its rightful place among the great nations. The military reality was considerably less glorious. The Ottoman forces proved more resilient than Italian planners had expected, and more importantly, the Libyan population had its own views on the matter and was not inclined to accept Italian occupation simply because Italy had decided to impose it. The Senussi, a Sufi Islamic brotherhood with deep roots in Cyrenaica, provided the organizational backbone of resistance. The Senussi order had been founded in the 19th century and had built, over decades, a network of lodges, schools, and community organizations across the eastern Libyan plateau that was, in effect, a parallel government, one with popular legitimacy that the Italian administration would never have. Italy formally took control of Libya under the Treaty of Lausanne in 1912, after the Ottoman Empire agreed to withdraw. What this meant in practice was that Italy now controlled the coastal cities and some of the interior, but the Senussi and the tribal confederations that supported them controlled the Jebel Aghdar, the Fezzan in the south, and large stretches of the country that Italian forces could reach but could not hold without constant reinforcement. This is the situation that would persist, with variations for the next 2 decades. Italy would advance, establishing garrisons and administrative posts. Libyan resistance, organized under the Senussi and various tribal leaders, would resist, harass supply lines, ambush columns, and demonstrate repeatedly that occupying a country and controlling it are very different propositions. Italian commanders would respond with punitive expeditions, collective punishment of communities suspected of harboring fighters, and the kind of escalating violence that colonial administrators have used since the beginning of colonial administration, discovering with reliable consistency that terror and violence intensify resistance rather than extinguishing it. The First World War interrupted Italian colonial operations. Italy's catastrophic losses at the Battle of Caporetto in 1917, where the Austrian and German offensive shattered multiple Italian divisions and produced 300,000 prisoners, redirected military resources and attention from Libya to the much more immediate problem of survival on the European front. The Libyan resistance, recognizing the opportunity, expanded its control. By 1918, the Senussi effectively controlled most of Cyrenaica, outside the coastal cities, and Italy emerged from the First World War technically on the victorious Allied side, but feeling profoundly cheated. The Paris Peace Conference had not delivered the territorial gains that Italian negotiators had been promised, at least implicitly, in exchange for entering the war. The phrase mutilated victory, vittoria mutilata, was coined by the poet Gabriele D'Annunzio and immediately became the defining phrase of Italian post-war politics. A country that had sacrificed 600,000 dead and had received in return not the empire it had been promised, but the humiliation of being treated as a lesser power at the table where the map was being redrawn. Into this atmosphere of national resentment and institutional crisis walks a former school teacher, a journalist, and a man who had been expelled from the Italian Socialist Party for supporting the war, and had spent the years since building a new political movement out of the disaffected veterans, the disappointed nationalists, the people who believed Italy had been robbed of its destiny. Benito Mussolini. The fascists take power in October 1922 through the Marcia su Roma, the March on Rome, which is less a march than a political bluff executed with theatrical flair. Mussolini presents the king with a fait accompli. The fascists have mobilized, the government has collapsed, and the king can either appoint Mussolini prime minister or face the prospect of civil conflict. The king, Victor Emmanuel III, appoints Mussolini. The bluff works. For Mussolini and the fascists, Libya is not merely a colonial possession. It is a demonstration. So it is the place where the new Italy, the Italy of discipline and will and imperial ambition, would prove itself. It would prove that Italy was capable of the kind of decisive, ruthless action that made empires. It would silence the critics who said Italy was not serious. It would avenge Adwa, redeem the mutilated victory, fulfill the Roman destiny that Mussolini's rhetoric invoked at every available opportunity. But Libya was still not pacified. The Senussi resistance under Omar Mukhtar had been intensifying through the mid-1920s. Mukhtar was 60 years old, a former Quran teacher who had become one of the most effective guerrilla commanders of the 20th century. His forces were small, mobile, deeply familiar with the terrain, and sustained by the loyalty of the Cyrenaican population that saw him, correctly, as the defender of their way of life against an occupation they had not chosen and did not want. His tactics were classic guerrilla. Strike and disappear, ambush and withdraw, make every Italian advance cost more than Rome could comfortably afford. 3 successive Italian governors of Cyrenaica had tried and failed to break the resistance. Pietro Badoglio, later to play his own significant role in Italian military history, had attempted a mix of military pressure and political negotiation. The negotiation had produced agreements that the Italian side did not honor. The military pressure had been insufficient. Mukhtar's forces remained operational. In 1930, Mussolini made a decision. The previous approaches had been too hesitant, too bound by the niceties of governance, too unwilling to take the drastic action that the situation required. And what Libya needed, Mussolini decided, was not an administrator. It was a soldier, a particular kind of soldier. A soldier who understood that in colonial warfare, the rules that applied in European conflicts between European powers were not the relevant rules. A soldier who would not hesitate. A soldier who would be as ruthless as the situation required and would not trouble himself with the opinions of people who thought ruthlessness was inappropriate. He found exactly that man. Remember the name, Rodolfo Graziani. Graziani had already earned a reputation in Libya. He had served in the western province of Tripolitania and had suppressed the Tripolitanian resistance with methods that his superiors had noted approvingly and his subordinates had described in private with varying degrees of discomfort, saying he was known as a commander who got results. The results, as we will discuss in considerable detail, were achieved through a particular understanding of what results meant in a colonial context, which is to say, through the organized application of violence against civilian populations, through mass executions, through collective punishment at a scale that made the mere military defeat of the resistance seem almost incidental. There is one figure who stands between the Italian state and its ambitions, and his name is Omar Mukhtar. Omar Mukhtar is not a young man in 1930. He is 67 years old. He was born in 1858 in a small village on the eastern Libyan plateau, the son of a local leader, and was educated in the Senussi tradition, the Quran, Islamic jurisprudence, and of the traditions of the order that had organized Cyrenaican community life for 3 generations. He became a teacher himself, a respected figure in the religious and educational network of the Senussi lodges, a man whose standing in his community was earned through scholarship and piety rather than through military accomplishment. Then the Italians arrived. He took up arms in 1911 when the invasion began, and he did not put them down for 20 years. This is the fact that the historical record most needs you to hold. 20 years. A man who was a school teacher and a Quran instructor spent the last 2 decades of his life conducting a guerrilla war against a modern European army, in terrain that the European army controlled from the cities, with resources that were always inadequate, with forces that were always outnumbered. And he did it successfully enough that 3 successive Italian military governors could not break him. He won strategically in every engagement for 20 years by the simple expedient of not losing. Because in asymmetric warfare, not losing is winning. Every Italian patrol that was ambushed and took casualties was a failure. Every negotiated agreement that the Italian side made and then violated was a demonstration that the resistance had something to negotiate. Every year that passed without total defeat was evidence that total defeat was not certain, and that evidence sustained the population that sustained the fighters. Graziani understands this dynamic perfectly. It is why the plan he brings to Cyrenaica is not a military plan primarily. It is a demographic plan with military enforcement. Says he arrives in Cyrenaica in January 1930 with a plan. The plan has a formal name, Pacification. It has a timeline. It has a budget. It has a logic that is, if you accept the premise, internally coherent. And it has, as its central mechanism, an idea so brutal in its implications that it took several months of preparation to implement, because even within an imperial administration that had normalized considerable violence, it required a certain infrastructure of cruelty that had to be built before it could operate. Aisha's village is part of the infrastructure. She just doesn't know it yet. But we do. We know what is in the plan. We know what the barbed wire along the coast will look like when it is finished, and we know what will happen in the camps. And we know what Mukhtar's photograph will look like when it is taken after his capture. And we know the number, 50,000 dead. We are in the privileged and terrible position of knowing how this story ends for everyone in it. That knowledge is a responsibility. The obligation of knowing how things ended is to understand how they got there. Not to perform outrage at a comfortable distance from history, but to trace the mechanism clearly enough to recognize it when it appears in different clothes in different times. The mechanism is about to start. Let's meet the man running it. Rodolfo Graziani was born on August 11, 1882, in Filettino, a small hill town in the province of Frosinone, in the Apennine Mountains, southeast of Rome. Filettino is not a place that appears in most histories of Italy. It is a place of the kind that produces a certain type of ambitious man, a small, poor, and peripheral community in a country that has its wealth and its power concentrated in the cities, in the north, in the centers of administration and commerce that a boy from Filettino could see from a distance but not easily reach. His father was a school teacher. The family was not wealthy but was literate, educated in the particular way of provincial school teachers' families, with access to books and ideas, but not to the social capital that determined how far those ideas could take you. The military was the path. In Italy, at the turn of the 20th century, the military offered something to a provincial boy of modest means that civilian life could not easily provide. A clear hierarchy, a system of advancement based on demonstrated competence rather than inherited connections, and, most importantly, a route into the national life that otherwise remained largely closed to men without family, without wealth, without the right name. You could rise in the army through your own effort. You could make yourself in the army into someone whose origins did not entirely define him. This is a recurring feature in the biographies of men who become architects of violence, not because military service is inherently pathological. It is not, but because the specific combination of provincial ambition, institutional loyalty, and the desire to prove oneself creates a psychological type that is particularly vulnerable to what institutions do, which is to harness ambition, channel it toward institutional goals, and reward the channeling with the advancement that ambition craves. Graziani enrolled at the military academy in Rome. So he was a capable student, not exceptional but steady, the kind of student who masters what is required and does not waste energy on what is not. He graduated in 1903 and received his commission as a second lieutenant in the infantry. He was 21 years old. His early career followed the standard progression of a capable junior officer: postings, exercises, the bureaucratic rhythm of peacetime soldiering. He served in Eritrea in 1908, his first experience of colonial administration, his first exposure to the particular moral and practical atmosphere of a place where Italian military law operated without the constraints that applied in the metropole, where the people around you were classified differently from the people you had grown up with, and where a certain kind of authority was available to a junior officer that would have been inconceivable in Frosinone or Rome. He would return to that atmosphere repeatedly. It suited him. There is something to examine carefully here about what colonial postings did to Italian officers in this period. The sociologist Frantz Fanon, writing from his own experience of French colonialism in Algeria 2 generations later, described the way colonial administration required its agents to construct a dual consciousness, one that operated in the colony, where certain actions were available, certain categories of person existed, certain methods were appropriate, and one that operated in the metropole, where those same actions, categories, and methods would be incomprehensible or criminal. The colonial officer maintained both simultaneously, the moving between them when he traveled home on leave and back when he returned to post. Graziani does not seem to have found this duality particularly taxing. His correspondence from the Eritrea period shows a man who adapted to the colonial atmosphere, not with the discomfort of someone maintaining a double life, but with the ease of someone who has found an environment that fits. He liked the authority. He liked the clarity of a situation in which the hierarchy was explicit, and his position in it was well defined. He liked the particular freedom from constraint that colonial administration offered, the freedom to make decisions quickly without the slow procedural accountability that civilian governance theoretically required. He liked being the man who decided. The First World War interrupts this trajectory in the way it interrupted everything. Italy enters the war in May 1915, having negotiated with both sides and accepted the Allied offer of territorial gains in exchange for Italian military participation. Graziani serves on the Isonzo front, the grinding series of battles along the border with Austria-Hungary, where Italian and Austro-Hungarian forces fought 11 major engagements over 2 years for territory measured in hundreds of meters. The Isonzo front was, by any measure, an experience of industrialized slaughter comparable to the Western Front. Trenches, artillery, mass infantry, assaults against prepared positions, casualty rates that stripped units to fragments and required constant replacement from the pool of conscripts that Italy was feeding into the machine. Graziani serves with distinction, which in the context of the Isonzo means he manages to function, to maintain unit cohesion, to execute orders and survive. He is promoted, he receives decorations, he emerges from the war as a major, with a record that marks him as a reliable, effective officer who performs well under the specific pressures of industrial warfare. What the Isonzo does to a man psychologically is harder to measure. The historical and psychological literature on the effects of industrialized trench warfare on the men who survived it is extensive and arrives at conclusions that are not surprising. That the normalization of mass death as a daily operational reality changes something in people, that it recalibrates the threshold at which violence registers as extraordinary rather than routine. The men who survive the Isonzo have spent years in an environment where the deaths of hundreds are a minor tactical outcome, and the deaths of thousands are simply what Tuesday looks like. This normalization does not produce sadists necessarily. It produces men for whom death in large numbers does not carry the emotional weight it carries for people who have not lived inside it. The Battle of Caporetto in October 1917 is the defining Italian military catastrophe of the war. An Austro-Hungarian and German offensive that breaks through the Italian lines in hours and produces, over the following weeks, a rout of 300,000 Italian prisoners, 10,000 dead, and a retreat of over 150 kilometers. The Italian army loses in days what it has taken 2 years to gain. Graziani is in this campaign. He survives, so as he witnesses the collapse of an army that has fought with extraordinary stubbornness and discipline, brought to disintegration by a combination of tactical innovation by the enemy and the accumulated exhaustion of men asked to do too much for too long. Caporetto shapes the Italian officer class in ways that will matter for decades. It produces a set of conclusions about will, resolution, and the failure of civilian government to properly support military necessity. The lessons are: be more decisive, act without hesitation, do not allow sentiment to constrain military judgment. These are fascist lessons before fascism formally exists. And Graziani absorbs them, carries them forward, and finds in the colonial theater the ideal environment for their application. Graziani emerges from the war with this recalibration, and with something else, a hunger for the promotion and recognition that the war has made possible. He is a major at 36. He wants to be more. The army, in peacetime, contracts. The competition for advancement tightens. The men who rise are the ones who find opportunities to demonstrate capability in circumstances where capability can be demonstrated, which in the 1920s, for a career Italian officer, means the colonies. He arrives in Libya for the first time in 1921, posted to the western province of Tripolitania. Tripolitania in 1921 is in the middle of a protracted war. The Italian administration has been attempting, with mixed results, to extend its control from the coastal cities into the interior. And the interior has been resisting with a persistence and effectiveness that has cost Italian forces considerably more than the initial occupation planners had anticipated. Graziani is assigned to command military operations against the Misrata and Tarhuna tribal confederations in the western interior. And what he does in that assignment is something worth examining carefully, because it establishes the template for everything that comes after. He uses collective punishment. This requires a moment's examination, because collective punishment is one of those practices that seems obviously wrong when stated plainly, but has been normalized so completely within the discourse of colonial warfare that its practitioners rarely named it as what it was. The logic of collective punishment says, because I cannot identify with certainty which individual members of this community are aiding the resistance, I will hold the community as a whole responsible for the resistance that operates within it. I will destroy the community's capacity to function, its food, its shelter, its livestock, its leadership, until the cost of harboring resistance becomes intolerable. The logic has a certain internal coherence. If you accept the premise that the civilian population and the resistance are a unified system rather than separate entities, then disrupting the system's support infrastructure makes military sense. The problem with the premise is that it is usually false. Most civilians who live in areas where guerrilla fighters operate are not active participants in the resistance. They are people trying to survive, who may provide food to fighters because the fighters are their sons or brothers or community members, or because refusing would be dangerous, or because they agree with the resistance's goals, or simply because the fighters arrive at their tent asking for water, and it is not possible to refuse a man who is armed and hungry. Collective punishment does not distinguish between these situations. It applies the same consequence to the family that hides a fighter in their basement, and to the family that has no connection to the resistance at all. The connection between the punishment and the individual's conduct is severed. What remains is simply the demonstration that the entire community can be made to suffer for the actions of a part of it. That collective identity is a collective liability. Graziani understands this perfectly. He is not confused about what he is doing. His reports from the Tripolitania period describe collective punishment in the precise language of a man who has thought about the mechanism and concluded that it is the right tool for the job. He is not apologetic about it. He is satisfied with it. This is not unusual in colonial warfare. It is, in fact, close to universal. When a regular military force cannot defeat a guerrilla resistance through conventional engagement, because the guerrillas do not stand and fight, because they are indistinguishable from the civilian population, because they depend on the civilian population for food and shelter and information. The temptation is always to attack the civilian population itself. Remove the water that the fish swim in Mao's later formulation. Destroy the support base. Make the cost of harboring resistance too high for any community to bear. Graziani implements this template with a thoroughness and an absence of apparent hesitation that distinguishes him from some of his contemporaries. Villages suspected of providing support to resistance fighters are burned. Livestock is confiscated or killed. Tribal leaders identified as sympathetic to the resistance are arrested and, in many documented cases, executed. The executions are not conducted in the heat of battle. They are administrative acts. Men are identified, tried before military tribunals that have no meaningful independence, sentenced and shot or hanged. The process has a procedural veneer that gives it the appearance of law, while producing outcomes that are determined in advance. He is decorated for his results in Tripolitania. He is promoted to general. He is given Cyrenaica. But before we follow him there, it is worth pausing on the fascist context in which this promotion occurs, because the context is not backdrop. It is mechanism. Mussolini's regime has been in power since 1922, and by 1928 it has moved well past the parliamentary maneuvering of its early years into something more structurally authoritarian. Press censorship is in place. Opposition parties have been dissolved. The secret police, the Ovra, is operational. The cult of the Duce, of Mussolini as the embodiment of the national will, the man of destiny who alone can restore Italy to greatness, is being systematically constructed through every available medium of mass communication. Within this regime, the colonial success in Libya serves a specific political function. Libya is where the new Italy demonstrates to itself and to the world that it is an empire capable of the decisive action that empires require. Libya is where the rhetoric of Roman destiny gets tested against physical reality. Every commander who pacifies a province, who eliminates a resistance movement, who expands Italian control over another stretch of the Libyan interior, is performing not just a military function, but an ideological one. He is proving that fascist methods work, that the fascist man, resolute, decisive, contemptuous of weakness, is the kind of man who makes empires. Graziani is the ideal fascist colonial soldier, not because he adopted fascist ideology cynically for advancement, but because the ideology that fascism formalized had been, in various forms, the operating ideology of Italian colonial administration for years before Mussolini arrived. Graziani had been practicing fascist methods in Eritrea and Tripolitania before fascism existed as a political movement. When the movement arrived, it found in him a man who already spoke its language. The ideology that enables Graziani's methods is worth examining because it is not simply personal cruelty, though personal cruelty may have played a role. It is the ideology of fascism as applied to colonial administration, which combines several elements that reinforce each other into a coherent system of thought. The first element is racial hierarchy. Italian fascism drew heavily on the pseudo-scientific racism that was current throughout European and American intellectual life in the early 20th century. And while Mussolini's racial views were initially more fluid than Hitler's, by the late 1920s and certainly by the 1930s, the official fascist position was that there was a hierarchy of civilizations, that the Latin peoples stood near the apex of that hierarchy, and that the peoples of Africa occupied positions toward its base. This hierarchy was not merely an opinion. It was, in the fascist framework, a fact of nature that justified the organization of the world accordingly. If a superior civilization was organizing an inferior one, that was not oppression. It was the natural order. The second element is the fascist theory of the state, which held that the interests of the nation, conceived as a biological organism with its own will and destiny, superseded the interests of individuals within it. And this applied domestically. Italian citizens were expected to subordinate their individual interests to the national interest as defined by the regime. It applied much more forcefully to the people of occupied territories who had no standing within the Italian national community and whose interests were, in the operational logic of the regime, not interests that the state was obligated to consider. The third element is the cult of will, of decision, of the man who does not hesitate. Fascism celebrated the capacity for ruthless action as a positive good. The man who pulled back, who negotiated when he should have acted, who thought too much about the suffering his actions caused. This man was not moral. He was weak. Weakness was the primary fascist sin, when the greatest expression of strength was the capacity to do difficult things without flinching. Graziani embodied all three elements. He believed, with what appears to have been genuine conviction, that the Libyan resistance was not a legitimate political movement, but a criminal conspiracy against civilized order. He used the language of bandits and criminals, not rebels or fighters. This linguistic choice was not semantic quibbling. It was a categorical decision that removed the resistance from the framework in which organized armed opposition might have rights, might be entitled to treatment as prisoners of war, might exist in a moral category that required some response other than elimination. And he believed that the Cyrenaican population's support for Mukhtar's resistance was not a political choice that the population had made and that the Italian administration needed to engage with. It was a structural problem to be solved by structural means. The population supported the resistance because the population was adjacent to the resistance, because the resistance moved through the population like water through a sponge. The solution was to remove the sponge, remove the population. This is the idea that Graziani presents to Badoglio and Mussolini in the winter of 1929 to 1930, and it is worth dwelling on the moment in which it is presented and approved, because the approval is the mechanism that turns an individual's cruelty into a state policy. Graziani is not acting alone. He is acting as an agent of the Italian state, and with the knowledge and authorization of the Marshal Pietro Badoglio, the Governor-General of Libya, and the explicit approval of Benito Mussolini in Rome. the specific order for the forced relocation of the Cyrenaican population, the entire population of the Jebel Akhdar and the adjacent plateau, roughly 100,000 people, into concentration camps is a state decision made at the highest levels of the Italian government. The plan has two objectives. Before we enumerate them, it is worth sitting for a moment with the fact that there is a plan at all. A written plan. A plan that was presented in meetings, reviewed by superiors, approved at the ministerial level, and transmitted down the command chain as operational orders. A plan that had a budget, a timeline, and designated responsible officers for each component. This matters because it forecloses the defense of ignorance. It forecloses the defense of chaos. It forecloses the defense that it was soldiers acting outside their orders, that it was the fog of war, that it was the spontaneous brutality of men in difficult circumstances, rather than the deliberate policy of an administration that knew what it was doing and decided to do it anyway. The plan was written. The plan was approved. The plan was executed. The plan had two objectives. The first is military. Without the population, Mukhtar's fighters lose their supply base. They cannot feed their horses, cannot feed themselves, cannot recruit, cannot get intelligence, cannot treat their wounded in the network of lodges and friendly households that has sustained them for 2 decades. Without the population, the resistance becomes a small group of men wandering in a depopulated landscape, isolated, unsupplied, waiting to be found and killed. The second objective is political. Cyrenaica, emptied of its inconvenient inhabitants, can be resettled by Italian colonists. This is the other half of the project, less discussed in the historical literature on Graziani, but essential to understanding why the relocation takes the form it does. Libya was supposed to be Italy's agricultural colony, its demographic relief valve, the place where the surplus population of poor southern Italy could go and build new lives on new land. The Italian settlers who were being recruited and transported across the Mediterranean needed land. The land was occupied by Libyans. The solution to this problem, in the logic of Italian colonial policy, that was to make the land unoccupied. Graziani, at the moment of his greatest authority, is doing two things simultaneously: prosecuting a military campaign against an armed resistance and conducting what we would now call an ethnic displacement, the systematic removal of a civilian population from its ancestral territory to make way for settlers of a different ethnicity. He does not call it this. He calls it sanitation. He uses the language of hygiene, of order, of removing the conditions that permit disease to spread. The metaphor of resistance as disease and pacification as medical treatment is a recurring feature of colonial administrative language, and it is not accidental. Medical language is language that has already done the work of placing the subject in a passive object category, found to the patient who is acted upon rather than the person who acts. Diseases do not have political interests. Diseases do not have rights. Diseases are managed through the application of appropriate technique, and the technique is determined by the physician, not the disease. Graziani is the physician, the Cyrenaican population is the pathology to be treated. This framework does not arrive fully formed in 1930. It is assembled over the course of his career from pieces that are available throughout the institutional environment he has spent 30 years inside. The racial science that classifies African peoples in specific ways, the military doctrine that frames guerrilla resistance as criminal rather than political, the fascist ideology of will and decisiveness that rewards ruthlessness as strength, to the colonial administration tradition that has been normalizing collective punishment and forced relocation since the first European empires began. Graziani does not invent any of these components. He assembles them, applies them, and is rewarded for applying them effectively. This is how the ideology of atrocity is typically transmitted, not as a single revelation, but as an accumulation of available frameworks, each of which contributes a piece of the architecture, until the architecture is complete enough to support the specific action being contemplated. He writes about this in his memoirs, not with the language of displacement or colonization, with the language of order, of necessity, of the difficult measures required by an extraordinary situation. He is proud of it. He regards it as one of the signal achievements of his career. Back in the convoy that Aisha is walking in, her brother holds her hand. He does not understand what is happening. He asks if they are coming back. She does not know how to answer him, because she does not know, and because something in the particular way the soldiers are moving through their village, the particular completeness with which everything is being taken or destroyed, suggests an answer that she is not ready to give a 9-year-old. She says, "I don't know." She means, "I think we are not." She is right. The barbed wire arrived before the people did. This is how you know the camps were planned. You do not order and transport hundreds of miles of barbed wire, erect the fences, dig the latrines, construct the guard posts before the people arrive, unless you have planned in advance for the people to arrive. And the camps along the Libyan coast, at Soluk, at Sidi Ahmed el-Magroun, at El Abiyah, at Marsa Brega, and a dozen smaller sites, were built before the deportations began by military engineers who were following blueprints drawn in offices in Benghazi and approved in Rome. The scale of the operation was enormous. Approximately 100,000 people were relocated from the Jebel Akhdar and the plateau country of northeastern Cyrenaica between March and June of 1930. This is the entire settled and semi-settled population of a substantial region, moved at gunpoint over distances that ranged from 50 to several hundred kilometers, walking or on camels where transport was available, to camps along the coastal strip where the Italian military could monitor and control them. The logistics required the coordination of multiple military commands, the requisitioning of civilian transport, the establishment of water points along the routes, and the planning of reception facilities at the destination. The planning, in other words, was thorough. The camps were not. Or rather, the camps were thorough in the ways that mattered to their designers: secure perimeters, guard positions, administrative registers, and insufficient in the ways that mattered to the people inside them. There was not enough food, there was not enough water, there was almost no medical care. The shelter was minimal, tents inadequate for the coastal winter, which was colder than the plateau the deportees had come from. The sanitation was inadequate from the beginning and deteriorated as the population density increased. Disease moved through the camps with the efficient logic of communicable pathology in crowded, malnourished, immunologically depleted populations. Trachoma, typhus, malaria, in the coastal lowlands where Cyrenaican plateau dwellers had never built up the partial immunity that local populations develop. Dysentery, the most democratic of camp diseases, killing with an equanimity that makes no distinctions between the young and the old, between the people who arrived healthy and those who arrived already weakened by the forced march. Aisha arrives at the camp near Soluk in late April 1930. The journey has taken 9 days on foot for her family, longer for the older people and the families with young children. 2 people from her village die on the march: an elderly woman who cannot maintain the pace and is left by the roadside by guards who cannot slow the column for the dying, and an infant whose mother runs dry of milk on the 4th day and has nothing to replace it with. 9 days on foot, with whatever water they had been allowed to carry, in the coastal spring heat that is not brutal but is not kind. with the soldiers maintaining the pace and the stragglers left behind. Aisha carries her brother on her back for long stretches when his feet blister and he cannot keep up on his own. She's 17. She has been in good health her entire life, fed on dairy and meat and the grain her family's modest prosperity has always provided. She manages the 9 days. Others do not. The route from the Jebel Akdar to the coastal camps covers terrain that descends from the plateau through a series of escarpments toward the sea. The landscape is spectacular, and in the way that landscapes seen in circumstances of forced march at gunpoint are often spectacular and unnoticed. The limestone ridges, the stunted trees, the spring wildflowers on the plateau edge, all of it passes by unremarked, because the attention of the people walking is on the feet of the person in front of them, on the children who need carrying, on the elderly who need supporting, on the calculation of whether the pace is sustainable for another hour, another day. The camp is a shock, not because of violence, not immediately. The shock is subtler and in some ways more disturbing, the shock of compression. The camp holds, when her family arrives, somewhere between 10 and 15,000 people in a space that would be adequate for perhaps a quarter of that number. But the spaces between tents are so narrow that you cannot stretch both arms without touching the canvas of the tents on either side. The smell is the specific smell of too many human beings in too small a space with inadequate sanitation. Sweat and refuse, and something organic and sweet that she will later learn is the smell of people who are beginning to die slowly. The administration of the camp is bureaucratic in the way that imprisonment is always bureaucratic. There are registers, identity documents, categories of compliance and non-compliance. The Italian military officers who run the camp work from a system of rules and procedures that has been transmitted down from the command structure above them. Some of these officers are efficient and brutal. Some are efficient and indifferent, and a small number are efficient and troubled. Men who understand that what they are managing is not a security operation but something closer to a mass killing by administrative means, who write letters home that describe their situation with a discomfort they cannot resolve. The bureaucracy of this camp has a specific quality. The population inside has no relationship to the Italian state except as a problem to be managed. There is no law protecting them. The military tribunal that nominally adjudicates disputes operates within the command chain and has no independence. The camps are not governed by law in any meaningful sense. They are governed by the logic of the Pacification directive. Keep them in, keep the resistance out. Do not use more resources than necessary. Not more resources than necessary. And this sentence explains the food ration. It means the minimum required to maintain a population at a level that is operationally functional, not healthy, not rebuilding, functional enough to labor in Italian fields and not die quickly enough to attract international attention. The calculation is not about cruelty as an end. It is about resource optimization in a context where the lives being managed have no political weight and therefore no cost. The letters are remarkable documents. One officer, not named in the sources that have preserved his correspondence, writes to his wife in 1930 that the camp is a place in which it is difficult to maintain one's sense of oneself as a civilized man. He describes the mortality figures he is required to file weekly, the numbers of deaths from disease and starvation, and says that the numbers feel like a condemnation of something he cannot name. He continues to file the reports. He continues to administer the camp. He does not resign. He does not refuse orders. He files the reports and writes to his wife about his discomfort and goes to bed and gets up and does it again. This is how these things work. The officer is not a monster. He is not a sadist who has found the right environment for his pathology. He is a man who has been placed in an administrative role within an institutional structure that has already made the relevant moral decisions at a level above him, and his options are to comply or to refuse, and refusal has costs, professional, social, possibly legal, that he has not been prepared to pay, and so he complies. And compliance, repeated daily over months and years, it becomes its own form of commitment. Each report he files is a choice he has made to continue. Each choice to continue makes the next choice slightly easier. The accumulation of small compliances produces a man who has, by the end, participated substantially in something terrible, through a sequence of individual steps, each of which felt, at the moment it was taken, like the path of least resistance. The philosopher Philip Zimbardo, studying the psychology of situational compliance, arrived at a formulation that applies here. Good people can do evil things when placed in the right situational context. The right context means a context where authority is unambiguous, where the moral categorization of the people being harmed has been done in advance by someone with more power, where compliance is the institutionally rewarded behavior, and where refusal requires an act of individual moral courage that most people, most of the time, are not prepared to perform. The Libyan concentration camps are the right context. Graziani has set it. The Italian colonial administration has set it. The fascist state has set it. The individual officers who administer the camps are inheriting a context, not creating one, which is both a partial explanation and not an excuse. This is how these things work. The food ration in the camps is calculated at a level that Italian military nutritionists, according to their own documents, knew was insufficient to maintain adult body weight. This is documented in internal correspondence that survived the war and was examined by Italian historians in the 1970s and 1980s. The ration of barley, some olive oil, and a minimal additional food was set not at a subsistence level, but below it. The deportees were expected to supplement their rations by selling their labor to Italian agricultural operations in the coastal area, which had the additional benefit of providing cheap labor for the settlers the Italian government was installing on the land that the deportees had just vacated. The arrangement was not coincidental. The deportees were simultaneously being starved out of independence and forced into economic dependence on the Italian colonial economy. Their land had been taken. Their livestock had been taken or killed. The only labor market available to them was the Italian one, which paid the minimum necessary to secure cooperation, and not more. Meanwhile, in the depopulated Jebel Akhdar, Graziani's military campaign against Omar Mukhtar intensifies. With the population removed, the resistance loses exactly what Graziani predicted it would lose. The network of support that has sustained Mukhtar's fighters for 2 decades dissolves. The lodges of the Senussi order that have served as rest points, supply depots, and recruitment centers are empty. The wells the fighters have relied on are controlled by Italian forces. The communities that have passed intelligence, shared food, hidden wounded men are behind barbed wire 100 miles away. Mukhtar adapts. He's a remarkable military mind, and the adaptation is impressive. His forces, reduced now to a few hundred men, move constantly, sleeping in different locations each night, using the remaining Bedouin families of the deep desert, those who have not been reached by the deportation, as their only remaining support. He continues to strike Italian convoys and patrols, demonstrating that the resistance cannot be eliminated simply by removing the population, but the strikes become less frequent, the recovery time between operations grows longer, the supply problems more acute. The barbed wire helps Graziani in another way. In September 1931, he orders the construction of a barbed wire barrier 270 kilometers long along the Egyptian border, from the coast to the desert interior, to cut off Mukhtar's supply lines and prevent reinforcement from the east. This is an extraordinary engineering undertaking. Hundreds of kilometers of double-fence barbed wire barrier in largely roadless terrain, wires with guard posts and patrol roads, and it is completed in approximately 3 months. The barrier does not just prevent resupply, it prevents escape. The remaining fighters are now enclosed in a shrinking perimeter, south of the coastal camps, east of the Italian military positions, north of the desert, and west of the Egyptian border fence. The net is closing. The construction of the barbed wire barrier along the Egyptian border is one of the more remarkable logistical feats of the Italian colonial period, and it is worth examining not just as a military operation, but as a symbol of what Graziani's method fundamentally is. The barrier is 270 kilometers long. It consists of double rows of barbed wire with a cleared zone between them. Guard posts are spaced along its length. Such a patrol road runs parallel to it so that Italian cavalry can move rapidly to any point where crossing is attempted. Think about what this means as a statement about the people it is designed to contain. You build a barrier like this when you have decided that the population on one side of it is a problem to be managed by containment. The barrier says, the geography that you have moved across freely for generations, following the seasonal logic of pastoral life, is now our geometry. We have imposed a line on your landscape. The line is enforced with wire and men with guns. The line does not care about your grazing patterns or your family connections on the other side or the wells that your great-grandfather dug in the zone that is now closed to you. The line is about us, about our military problem, about our need to complete our pacification on a schedule that Rome is watching. The barrier takes 3 months to build, 3 months to change the physical landscape of a region in a way that will be felt for decades. 3 months to encode, in wire and guard posts, the final statement of Graziani's project. This land is now ours, and your movement across it is subject to our permission, and we are withdrawing our permission. Omar Mukhtar is captured on September 11th, 1931. He is caught when his horse is shot out from under him after a skirmish with an Italian cavalry patrol near the Slonta-Marawa road. He is injured, but alive. He is 68 years old, with a white beard and the particular calm that witnesses consistently describe in very old men who have been expecting their end for some time and have made their peace with it. Thus his capture is treated as a triumph. He is transported to Benghazi, where he is held in a cell while Graziani decides how to use him. There is a documented discussion, preserved in Italian military correspondence, about whether Mukhtar might be useful alive. A staff officer suggests that his religious authority among the Cyrenaican population could theoretically be leveraged. If he appeared to endorse Italian administration, his credibility might help ease the transition to full pacification. Graziani dismisses the idea. His recorded response is precise. A man like this does not cooperate. He will appear to cooperate and then use whatever access we give him to continue what he's been doing. He needs to be removed from the equation. Removed from the equation. This is the language of a man who thinks in variables, who has so thoroughly converted the people in his operational environment into strategic elements that executing a 70-year-old prisoner is not a moral question, but a logistics one. What is the most efficient path to the desired outcome? The desired outcome is a pacified province. The variable that complicates it is Mukhtar. Remove the variable. There is a trial, military tribunal, the procedural veneer applied to a conclusion that has already been reached. Mukhtar does not deny that he has fought against the Italian occupation. He acknowledges it directly. He says, "I fight for my country." The tribunal sentences him to death. The execution is scheduled for September 16th, 5 days after his capture. Graziani makes a decision about the execution that is worth examining because it reveals the particular way his mind worked. He could execute Mukhtar in private or in front of a small military audience. He decides instead to conduct the execution publicly in front of the inhabitants of the Suluk concentration camp, approximately 20,000 deportees assembled by military order to watch the man who had fought for their freedom for 20 years be hanged. Think about what that means. He is not just executing a prisoner. He is staging a demonstration. He is using the body of an old man, a man those 20,000 people revere. A man whose resistance has kept alive the possibility that their situation might be temporary, that Italian rule might not be permanent, that something might change. He is using that body to communicate a specific message. This is what happens. This is the end of the story. There is no rescue coming. There is no other outcome. The staging is deliberate and detailed. The venue, the concentration camp, with its population of people who knew Mukhtar and what he represented, is chosen precisely because those 20,000 people are the audience that matters. The Italian military audience already knows the outcome and does not need to be taught it. But the Libyan audience, the people who have been sustained for 20 years by the knowledge that a man on a horse with a rifle could make the empire pay a price it could not sustain, those people need to see it end. The guards march the camp population to the assembly point. There is no choice in this. People who do not move are moved. 20,000 human beings are arranged around a gallows in a concentration camp on the Libyan coast and made to watch. Mukhtar is brought out, walking with difficulty, and he is wearing his white religious robes. The witness accounts describe a man who moves through the preparation for his own execution with a quality that the accounts struggle to name. Not resignation, not performance, something more like completion, the bearing of a man who has arrived at the end of a story he has lived fully and does not need to change. The accounts of what the watching crowd does during the execution are consistent across multiple sources, Italian and Libyan. There is silence, the particular kind of silence that a large crowd produces when it is holding something enormous and has nowhere for it to go. Mukhtar dies with the composure that witnesses consistently attribute to him. He is 70 years old. He does not break. He does not plead. He does not give Graziani the spectacle of a broken man. He gives him only a body. Graziani writes in his report that the execution has had the desired effect on the prisoner population. He means the silence. He interprets the silence as submission. He is partially wrong. The silence is not submission. It is the sound of something becoming permanent, the grief that has no outlet, the anger that has no immediate object, the loss that will not be recovered from, settling into the particular form of memory that is passed from parent to child, that outlasts the empire that produced it, that still resonates in Libya today when the name Mukhtar is mentioned or the photograph of the old man in his rope is shown. But Graziani is partially right. The resistance, organizationally, is finished. There will be no coordinated armed opposition to Italian rule in Cyrenaica for the remainder of the colonial period. The machine has done what it was designed to do. In the camps, the deaths continue. The Italian colonial archives contain the death records from the concentration camps for the period 1930 to 1933. These records are incomplete. Some were destroyed, some were never kept. Some exist only in the aggregate figures reported by camp commanders to the colonial administration. But the figures that survive are damning. The mortality rates in the camps during the peak period of 1930 and 1931 are consistent with what demographers would later call catastrophic. Death rates many times the normal baseline, driven by disease, starvation, and the physiological collapse that follows prolonged malnutrition. The Italian historian Giorgio Rochai, who conducted the first serious scholarly examination of the camps in the 1970s, estimated total deaths of approximately 50,000 people between 1930 and 1934, out of a total deported population of roughly 100,000. Half. He was careful to note that this figure was based on incomplete records and might be an undercount. Other estimates have ranged from 40,000 to 70,000, with the Libyan government's official position settling at a figure toward the higher end. 1 in 2. Aisha's father dies in the camp in the winter of 1930 from a respiratory infection that in ordinary circumstances would have been survivable. In the camp, with his immune system compromised by months of inadequate food, in a tent that does not keep out the coastal cold, without access to any medicine, till the infection becomes pneumonia, and the pneumonia becomes fatal. He dies over about 2 weeks, slowly enough that the family can watch it happen, not quickly enough to spare them anything. Her mother nurses him without medicine. She uses what she knows: steam from heated water, positions that ease breathing, the particular quality of attention that people bring to someone they are losing and cannot stop losing. It is not enough. None of it is enough, because the camp is structured in a way that ensures it will not be enough, that the margin between survival and death has been deliberately set by administrative decision at a level where the margin is very thin. He was 44 years old. He had managed his family's herd for 20 years. He had been to the market in Benghazi 3 times. He had 2 sons and a daughter, so he had never done anything to the Italian state except exist on land the Italian state had decided it wanted. He is added to the weekly death register. He becomes a number in a report. The report goes to Graziani's headquarters, where it is collated with the other weekly reports from the other camps along the coast, and the collated figures are compiled into a monthly summary. And the monthly summary is reviewed by a staff officer who marks the aggregate mortality figures as within expected parameters, and the summary is filed. Graziani does not read the individual names. He reads the aggregate figures. The aggregate figures are within expected parameters. The camps begin to empty in 1933, not because the Italian government has changed its policy or experienced a moral awakening. They empty because the resistance is over, because Mukhtar is dead, because the military objective that the camps were built to achieve has been achieved, and because the camps are becoming an embarrassment, not primarily a moral embarrassment. The regime does not operate on moral embarrassment. A practical one. The camps are killing too many people too quickly, and dead people cannot labor in Italian fields, cannot pay Italian taxes, cannot be subjects of the model colony that Italian propaganda is still describing to audiences in Rome and Milan. The deportees are released in stages over roughly 2 years into a Cyrenaica that is no longer theirs. Their land has been redistributed, some of it to Italian settlers, who began arriving in large organized convoys. The Ventimiglia, the groups of 20,000 settlers transported at state expense. From 1938 onward, though part of Mussolini's grand demographic project of demographic colonization, some of it to Italian agricultural companies that have been granted concessions to develop the newly emptied plateau. The ancient grazing routes that the Bedouin communities had maintained across generations are now divided by Italian farm boundaries. The wells that mark the geography of pastoral life have Italian names on the maps that govern water rights. Aisha's village does not exist anymore. The tents are gone, burned in 1930. The few permanent structures, modest stone buildings that the more settled families had built over decades, have been incorporated into an Italian farm. The graves of the village dead, the caves and hillside burials that represent the accumulated presence of generations, that are within the boundaries of a land concession that belongs to an Italian company that does not know they are there and would not care if it did. She returns to the Jebel in 1933 with her mother, her brother, and the handful of other survivors from her village. The return is not triumphant. It is the return of people who have lost a significant fraction of themselves, to death, to displacement, to the irreversible damage that years of starvation and grief and watching people die slowly inflicts on the human body and mind, to a landscape that is familiar in its physical features and unrecognizable in every human dimension. She will live on the Jebel for the rest of her life. She will marry, have children, rebuild the slow accumulation of a life on the margins of the Italian colony, and then, after 1943, on the margins of the British occupation, and then the independent Libyan state. She will tell her children what happened. She will tell her grandchildren. She will not write it down, because writing is not her tradition, and because the story does not need to be written down to be carried. It is carried in the body, in the specific ways that people who have survived catastrophe move through the world, with a particular kind of attention and a particular kind of distance from the things they cannot afford to lose. The Libyan researcher who records her testimony in the 1980s, a young academic named in the source, documents only by initials, is working in the difficult political atmosphere of Gaddafi's Libya, where the relationship between official memory and individual memory was fraught, describes her as a woman who speaks without emotion, but with absolute precision. Every date is correct. Every detail is stable across multiple tellings. She is not performing grief. She is performing testimony, the specific discipline of someone who has understood that the accuracy of the account matters, that the account is the only record that will survive, that if she gets it wrong, or softens it, or allows it to blur at the edges, something essential will be lost. She is 84 years old when she speaks to him. She has outlived Graziani by nearly 30 years. She has outlived the Italian colonial state and the British occupation and the monarchy, not in the first decade of the Gaddafi Republic. She has watched Libya change around her in ways that no one predicted. She has not changed on this. She knows what happened to her family, to her village, to her grandfather, to her father who died of pneumonia in a tent in a concentration camp. She knows it precisely. She will not allow it to be lost. She will live to see Graziani come back, because he comes back. Rodolfo Graziani's career does not end with Libya. It continues through Africa and through the Second World War, with a consistency of method that makes the Libya years look almost like a training exercise. After his success in Cyrenaica, Graziani is given Ethiopia. Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, the war that finally avenges Adwa, in the regime's triumphalist framing, requires pacification of the occupied territory. Santan Graziani, now the most experienced pacifier in the Italian military, is the obvious choice. He's appointed Viceroy of Italian East Africa in 1936. His methods in Ethiopia replicate and amplify his methods in Libya. In February 1937, a young Ethiopian man named Abraham Debok throws a grenade at Graziani during a public celebration in Addis Ababa. Graziani is wounded. He survives. His response to the assassination attempt is, by any standard of proportionality, staggering. Over 3 days of violence, Italian forces and their local Eritrean auxiliaries kill an estimated 19,000 Ethiopians in the capital and surrounding areas. They kill monks and priests at the ancient monastery of Debre Libanos, which they suspect of harboring resistance sympathizers, after first confirming that the monks have no connection to the attack. They kill people in the streets, in their homes, in the markets. Graziani reports the response as a necessary security operation. He's eventually recalled from Ethiopia in 1938, not because of the massacres, but because of tactical failures in the ongoing insurgency. He is not punished. He's given the title of Marshal of Italy, the highest military rank. He becomes governor of Libya a second time in 1940, briefly as Italy enters the Second World War. In 1943, after Italy's military disasters in North Africa and the Anglo-American invasion of Sicily, Mussolini is deposed by the fascist Grand Council. Italy surrenders to the Allies in September 1943. Graziani, uniquely among senior Italian military figures, sides not with the legitimate Italian government, but with Mussolini's German-backed puppet state, Tabur, the Italian Social Republic in northern Italy. He becomes Minister of National Defense of this entity, which means he spends the final 20 months of the war directing Italian forces in collaboration with the Nazi German occupation, conducting operations against Italian partisans who are fighting to liberate their own country. He's arrested in 1945, tried by an Italian military tribunal, convicted of collaboration with the German occupiers, and sentenced to 19 years in prison. He serves 4 months before being released under an amnesty. 4 months. For Libya, for Ethiopia, for the Addis Ababa massacres, for the concentration camps, for the 50,000 dead, for the hanging of Omar Mukhtar in front of 20,000 prisoners. 4 months. He is never tried for his crimes in Libya, as he is never tried for his crimes in Ethiopia. The Italian judicial system in the post-war period directs its limited appetite for accountability toward the collaboration with Germany that had occurred on Italian soil, and even that appetite is limited. The crimes committed in Africa against African people in the name of a colonial project that most Italians preferred to remember as a civilizing mission rather than a series of war crimes do not constitute a category that requires accounting. He retires to his estate in Affile, a village in the Lazio region, where he writes his memoirs, receives visits from former fascist colleagues, and lives as a respected elder of the Italian right, until his death in 1955, at the age of 72. He dies in his bed. He is given a state funeral. Sit with that for a moment. And the man who organized the forced relocation of 100,000 people into concentration camps where half of them died, who built the barbed wire fence along the Egyptian border to trap the survivors of his own policy, who staged a public hanging in front of 20,000 prisoners to demonstrate that their resistance was finally over. This man retires to a farm, writes his memoirs with satisfaction, receives visitors, and receives a state funeral. He is not in exile. He is not in hiding. He is not under surveillance. He is a retired Marshal of Italy, living in the country that made him what he was, treated with the respect due to a man of his rank. This is not a failure of justice in the narrow sense of a court that tried and acquitted. It is a failure, in the broader sense, a society that did not believe, at any institutional level, that what happened in Libya required accounting. Not because the facts were disputed. Graziani did not deny them. He described them with pride. But because the people it happened to were not the kind of people whose suffering triggered Italian institutional accountability. They were Libyans. They were African. They were colonial subjects. In the moral accounting of post-war Italy, which was primarily concerned with Italian suffering, Italian victims, Italian dignity, the 50,000 dead in the Cyrenaican camps did not register as an Italian responsibility to be addressed. They registered as a colonial episode to be noted and moved past. His memoirs describe the Libyan campaign with satisfaction. He regards it as an achievement. He describes Mukhtar with something approaching grudging respect, or the kind of respect that a hunter might express for a particularly elusive quarry. But he is clear that the execution was necessary and that the resistance needed to be broken, and that he broke it. He does not discuss the camps in detail. He does not discuss the dead. The word Graziani evokes in Libya today is not complicated. It is hatred, clear and unambiguous, and passed down through generations in the way that the names of people who have destroyed your world are passed down. The Libyan government has repeatedly demanded from Italy a formal apology and accountability for the colonial period, with the concentration camps and the execution of Mukhtar as the central exhibits of what needs to be acknowledged. Italy's response has been, for most of the post-war period, to not respond, nor to respond in ways that fall significantly short of what Libya has asked for. There have been moments of partial acknowledgement. The Treaty of Friendship signed between Italy and Libya in 2008, under which Italy agreed to pay $5 billion in investment as a form of reparation for the colonial period, without ever using the word reparation and without including a formal apology for specific atrocities. The treaty was brokered partly because Italy wanted Muammar Gaddafi's cooperation on migration and energy, which gives the financial transfer the character of a transaction rather than a moral reckoning. The Italian academic and cultural reckoning with the colonial period is, at best, incomplete. The comparison with Germany, which we made in the previous episode, applies here with even more force. Germany has built Holocaust memorials, criminalized denial, embedded accountability in its educational system, and made the public acknowledgement of what it did a central feature of German national identity. Italy has done none of these things with comparable seriousness or comprehensiveness. The colonial period, including Libya and Ethiopia, appears in Italian public education as a subject of marginal significance, if it appears at all. The details of the concentration camps, the death figures, the execution of Mukhtar are not part of the common cultural knowledge of Italian citizens in the way that the Holocaust is part of German common cultural knowledge. There are Italian historians who have done serious, honest work on this history. Giorgio Rocha's research on the camps in the 1970s was a landmark. Angelo Del Boca spent decades documenting Italian colonial violence in Africa and faced sustained institutional resistance for doing so. The work exists. It is not unknown. It is simply not central. And in Affile, the village where Graziani retired and died, there is a mausoleum. It was built in 2012 with public funding from the regional government of Lazio to honor Graziani as a son of the village. It features a bust of the marshal and was inaugurated with local civic ceremony. The construction prompted protests from Libya, from Jewish organizations. Graziani had also been involved in the persecution of Libyan Jews during his governorships, and from Italian anti-fascist groups. The local mayor said that the mausoleum honored a great Italian who had served his country. In 2017, an Italian court ruled that the mausoleum violated Italian law against the rehabilitation of fascism and ordered its removal. As of the most recent available information, the mausoleum remained partially standing. These things take time, or perhaps more precisely, these things take will, and the will has been intermittent. The question of Italian colonial memory is not primarily about the mausoleum in Affile, which is a symptom rather than a cause. It is about the broader architecture of national self-understanding, the stories a country tells its children in school, the monuments it builds and maintains and permits, the language it uses when addressing the descendants of the people it harmed. Libya's own history after independence in 1951 is a separate and complicated subject. The country was governed by King Idris, and whose family's Senussi heritage gave him a legitimacy rooted in the resistance tradition until a military coup brought Muammar Gaddafi to power in 1969. Gaddafi governed Libya for 42 years with a combination of anti-Western rhetoric, oil wealth, revolutionary ideology, and increasingly erratic personal rule that produced its own catalogue of internal violence. He was killed by his own people in 2011 during the Arab Spring uprising that NATO forces supported with air power, and his death left Libya in a state of political fragmentation and civil conflict that has still not been fully resolved. The complexity of Libya's post-independence history does not diminish what happened under Graziani. These are separate moral questions. The fact that a country's subsequent governments were also, in various ways, responsible for violence against their own people does not retroactively reduce the violence inflicted on them by a foreign colonial administration. It does, however, make the politics of acknowledgement and reparation more complicated, because the entity that would receive the acknowledgement is itself a complex and contested one. Omar Mukhtar's face appears on the 10-dinar Libyan banknote. He has appeared on various iterations of Libyan currency since independence. His image is also on the Libyan passport. He is in Libyan national memory, not merely a historical figure, but a founding symbol, the man who refused, whose refusal has been absorbed into the national identity as evidence of who the Libyan people understood themselves to be. His photograph, the one taken by Italian military authorities after his capture, showing an old man in white robes with a rope around his neck, looking at the cameras with an expression of complete calm, has become one of the iconic images of anti-colonial resistance in the 20th century, reproduced in museums and textbooks and protests from North Africa to Southeast Asia. As of the most recent information available, the mausoleum remained partially standing. These things take time. Let's come back to Aisha. She is not a historical figure in the sense that we can verify her specific story against documentary records. She is a composite, assembled from the testimonies of women from Cyrenaica who survived the camps and whose accounts have been gathered by Libyan researchers and oral historians over the decades since. Her specific details, the goats, the grandfather, the brother, the smell of the burning village, and the father dying of pneumonia in the winter of 1930, are drawn from these testimonies. She is, in the sense that matters, real. What she represents is the experience that the historical record most consistently and systematically obscures when it focuses on architects and empires and the men who sit at tables making decisions. The experience of the person the decision is made about. Not the policy and its rationale. Not the general and his strategy. Not the empire and its ambitions. The goats disappearing in the night. The grandfather who steps forward and is walked past. The smell of burning that follows you down the road for a long time. The demographic surveys conducted by Italian colonial administrators in the 1920s before the forced relocations counted approximately 225,000 people in Cyrenaica. The first reliable census after the camp period, conducted by the British occupation authorities in 1945, counted approximately 142,000. The missing 83,000 are accounted for by deaths in the camps, deaths during the deportation marches, deaths from disease and starvation in the period between the camp releases and the Second World War, and a factor that demographers note but that statistics cannot fully capture: the collapse of birth rates in communities under extreme stress, the children who were never born because the conditions for bearing and raising children had been systematically destroyed. 83,000 people. The number sits in the academic literature with the precision of a figure that has been carefully derived from incomplete sources and is therefore presented with appropriate scholarly caveats. But precision and completeness are different things, and the scholarly caveats are not a form of comfort. The 83,000 are a floor, not a ceiling. And behind the number are specifics. The 30% of the Cyrenaican camel population that died in the camps or was confiscated, eliminating the primary economic asset of a pastoral community. The olive groves in the Jebel Akhdar that were neglected during the displacement years and took decades to recover. The Senussi Lodge network, the schools, the clinics, the community centers, the organizational infrastructure that had served as the social backbone of Cyrenaican life. That was deliberately destroyed by the Italian administration as part of the Pacification, leaving communities without the institutional structures they had relied on for generations. So the knowledge of water sources, of medicinal plants, of seasonal grazing routes, of the specific geography of a life organized around a particular landscape, that was lost when the people who carried it died in the camps before they could pass it on. These are the dimensions of the destruction that do not fit easily into death tolls. The death tolls are devastating, but the destruction extends beyond the dead to the living, to what was taken from them that was not life itself, but was the infrastructure of life, the accumulated knowledge and organization and economic foundation that communities build over generations and cannot rebuild quickly when it is taken away all at once. The missing 83,000. None of them appear in the mausoleum in Affile. None of them appear in Graziani's memoirs. They appear, imperfectly and incompletely, in the oral histories that Libyan families have preserved, in the archives that Italian historians fought to open, in the testimonies of women like Aisha, who kept the story alive in the only way available to them, by telling it to the people who came after. Rodolfo Graziani sat at a table. He studied maps and wrote operational orders and approved logistics plans and filed reports and received promotions and decorations and eventually a mausoleum. He built a machine that killed 50,000 people, displaced 100,000 more, destroyed the economic and social infrastructure of an entire regional civilization, and cleared the land for settlers who arrived on ships from the Italian south, who were told they were going to build something new in a virgin land, who were not told about the people whose absence had made the land available. The settlers were not villains taken individually. They were poor people from the Mezzogiorno, from Sicily and Calabria and Campania, who had been told by a regime that promised them dignity and land, that Libya was their opportunity. They crossed the Mediterranean and built houses and planted crops and tried to make lives. Some of them knew, in a general way, that the land had not always been empty. Some of them did not. The regime had not seen fit to tell them the full story. The full story was inconvenient for the myth of the fourth shore, the virgin land, the Roman destiny being fulfilled. They are not the story either. They are another layer of the story's complexity. The people who benefited from the system without understanding or controlling it, who were themselves, in their way, instruments of the regime rather than its architects. The architect is Graziani, the one who sat at the table, the one who wrote the plan and had it approved and transmitted it down the chain and marked the report satisfactory and received the decorations and retired to the farm and wrote the memoirs and died in his bed. He believed he was right. He wrote as much, in the language of duty and discipline and civilizing mission, until the end of his life. He was wrong. He was wrong in the particular way that men who use the language of civilization to organize barbarism are always wrong, by confusing the categories of their ideology with the reality of the people living inside it. Aisha was not an obstacle to civilization. She was a person living a specific, valuable, irreplaceable human life that his machine reduced to a number in a weekly death report. The number was a person. That is the sentence that the historical record, if it is being done honestly, always comes back to. There is a concept in Holocaust studies called the incomprehensibility of large numbers, the documented psychological phenomenon by which the human mind, confronted with the deaths of millions, responds not with proportionally greater grief, but with numbness, a kind of emotional shutdown that occurs because the emotional processing systems are not built for that scale. One death is a catastrophe. 1,000 deaths is a statistic. The academic literature on this phenomenon is extensive, and it arrives at a conclusion that feels both obvious and important. The way to prevent emotional numbness from becoming moral numbness is to insist repeatedly on the individual within the aggregate. That is why Aisha exists in this episode. Not because her individual story is more important than the 50,000 deaths, but because she is the door through which the 50,000 deaths can be approached at human scale. She is the way in. Without her, the camps are a policy. Without her, Graziani is a historical figure of moderate significance. With her, the camps are the smell of burning behind you as you walk, and the weight of your brother on your hip, and the face of your grandfather when he lowered his arms. The historical record owes Aisha a name. The historical record owes all 50,000 of them a name. And it owes us, the people who are still alive in a world that those deaths helped to shape, the honesty to look at what happened without the protective distance of abstraction. The number was a person. And the person had a name, and a grandfather who tried to negotiate, and a little brother who asked if they were coming back, and a village whose smell she carried in her memory for the rest of her life. Remember that.